Hi, everybody. This is Jesse Paul, Colorado Sun political editor and reporter. Welcome to another Colorado Sun politics event. Thanks so much for joining us. We're excited tonight to have you to talk about Proposition HH and Proposition II if you want to join us on that one too. But I think most of the questions probably people will have will be about Proposition HH, which is very, very complicated. And I am very happy to be joined by Brian Eason, who just recently rejoined the Sun, who's going to help me kind of walk through your questions or answer your questions. And we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. We're going to go for about an hour tonight. You probably could spend many more hours than that on Proposition HH, just given how complicated it is. And so if you have questions throughout the event, feel free to drop them in the chat and they'll be sent over to Brian and I, but you can also send an email to questions@coloradosun.com and those will be sent to us and we'll try and answer them in real time. I'm kind of more focused on the effects of Proposition HH on your property taxes and your TABOR refunds, whereas Brian's done a lot of digging into the effects on revenue for local governments and fire districts and schools. So we'll kind of route the questions as appropriate there. Again, all of these events that we do at the Colorado Sun, all these political events are made possible by our members. So if you're not a member yet, hopefully you can join us over at coloradosun.com/join. It's quick and easy, and it really does make a big difference in making these kind of events possible. If you can become a premium member, you can get the unaffiliated newsletter where you can you can read Brian and I nerding out twice a week on Proposition HH and all kinds of other policy issues. So I'm just going to kind of give a Proposition HH overview with our explainer story here to kick things off. Hopefully some folks have read this, and the Sun folks who are managing the event tonight will drop a link in the chat. But, just in case you're completely kind of unaware of what Proposition 8 is, it was put on the legislature or put on the ballot this year by Democrats in the legislature with the help of Governor Jared Polis. His office really was the architect of this. And effectively what it would do is blunt the rise in property taxes in Colorado for at least the next 10 years. And this comes in response to the big increase in property values that we saw across the state during the pandemic. People remember the crazy real estate stuff that was going on. Obviously, we're kind of still in the midst of that, but property values rose as much as 40%, an average of 40% across the state. Some parts of the state even more, especially in the mountains. Douglas County, I think, was like 47%. And home values are a key component in determining what your property tax bill is. So the legislature responded. Democrats in the legislature responded with Proposition HH as a way to do that. So I'll kind of unpack a little bit about how that works exactly. So the first thing you need to know, though, is that your property taxes aren't going to go down under this if it passes below what they were before Proposition HH. So don't expect your 23 tax bill to look the same as your 22. It's going to go up, but what this is a decrease in the increase, and that's kind of a critical thing to understand. A lot of people are talking about how this raises property taxes. That is not true. It's a decrease on the increase. It does a lot of things, but one thing it definitively does, and it's hard to say, make definitive comments about this, but one of the things you can definitively say is that it lowers your property taxes below what they would be if it doesn't pass. So I'm not going to go through kind of how to calculate your property taxes. The story has a really good basis for that, and I think honestly every Colorado homeowner and Colorado renter should understand this, just so you can kind of get a sense for how this stuff works. But there are three factors that determine what your property taxes are. The first is the statewide assessment rate. The second is your local mill levy. And then the third is, what your property's value is determined by your county's assessor. And so what Proposition HH does, and the legislature only has control over this aspect of it, which is the statewide assessment rate. So what Proposition HH does is it lowers that state assessment rate slightly. And it also exempts a portion of the value of your home from taxation. So let's just say, your home is worth $400,000. Proposition HH in the first year would treat it like a $350,000 home. And then in the second year would be treated like a $360,000 home. And then, you factor into that the assessment rate, you multiply the value by the assessment rate, and then multiply that by what the local mill levy rate is. And mill levies, the rates differ from neighborhood to neighborhood, block to block. In some instances, there are thousands of local districts across the state. And it's important to know that property taxes are collected on the local level. This isn't collected on the state. So they fund, all of your local districts, your schools, your libraries, your ambulances, fire districts, stuff like that. So And the mill levy rates are set individually by each district. So, your school district oftentimes is at least half of what your property taxes are, and then the rest of it is made up by those extra things. And they're determined on an individual basis by the elected officials who make up those different boards. So that is the property tax relief function in Proposition HH. And for the purposes of this explainer, I'm only going to focus on residential. There's a similar break for commercial properties, but I think mostly people are probably on here wondering about how this affects their bottom line in terms of individual homeowners. So, I encourage people to go ahead and use some of the calculators we have on our site to look at that and plug in some of the numbers to see what their property tax bill would be with and without Proposition HH. But there's something else you should know about Proposition HH that is important, that's kind of complicated and sometimes gets missed in the conversation. And it's the so-called truth in taxation provision. So in addition to the rate reductions and the value reduction or value exemption in Proposition HH, the bill also imposes this requirement that a lot of local districts, not schools and home rule cities and counties, and again, that makes up a lot of your property taxes, but all other districts can only increase your property taxes in a given year or year over year by the rate of inflation. And so the idea is to kind of cap that increase. Now, that can be overridden by a vote of whatever that local district's board is, in addition to a public hearing. So there's a few steps that those folks have to take, but they can't override the cap. But generally, a lot of the proponents will talk about this as limiting, what your actual increase would be. And then, the big complicated part of what Proposition HH does, which I think is kind of the hardest to wrap your brain around, is how it tries to make up for the cuts to local districts and schools by taking what's known as your TABOR surplus, the state TABOR surplus, and backfilling all for schools and then a portion for the rest of local districts, the money that they would have gotten if Proposition HH hadn't passed. Because like I mentioned, property taxes fund things like schools and local districts, kind of all those important local government functions that we all rely on. And so the TABOR surplus, for a quick explainer on TABOR, it is calculated each year, caps government growth and spending. It increases each year only by inflation plus population. But Proposition HH would add an extra percentage point into that formula to increase the cap, and then all of the money that's kept in that percentage point is used by the legislature to backfill or reimburse schools and local governments. Again, local governments get a portion, schools get completely backfilled under Proposition HH. And that money is what's used traditionally to give your TABOR refunds, also known as the Colorado cashback last year. So by reducing that amount of money, you're getting smaller refund checks year over year. And in the long run, as that 1 percentage point compounds, the longer Proposition HH is in effect, it lasts for at least 10 years. There's an increased chance the further out that you wouldn't have a TABOR refund in a given year. Again, it doesn't eliminate them forever. That you'll hear that sometimes. That is not true. The TABOR cap, whether or not it's exceeded, is determined by economic conditions, and so much of this proposition and this ballot measure is determined. How it'll affect you, how it'll affect the state, is determined by economic conditions. In addition to just the nitty gritty policy aspects of it. So Brian, I think we'll get a little bit more into kind of the backfill mechanism and what that looks like later. But the thing you basically need to know, and again, it's hard to make definitive statements about this measure because it's so dependent on the economy. But basically, schools are kept whole. Local governments will lose out on quite a bit of money. There's a paragraph in here that I just want to highlight. So local districts, again, not schools, will lose. Are expected to lose at least 240 million in this fiscal year, 510 million in the next fiscal year, and 650 million in the 2026 fiscal year. Now, that's not a budget cut per se, but that's money that they would have gotten if Proposition HH hadn't passed, right? So if it passes, if it fails, I mean, all this money goes to the local districts. If it doesn't, they get a portion of what the decrease in revenue would be back from the legislature by using that TABOR surplus, in turn affecting what your TABOR caps would be, your TABOR refund would be. And then the final thing that you need to know about this, and this is for one year only change that Proposition HH would trigger, is for money that was collected by the state in excess of the TABOR cap in the 22-23 fiscal year, which just ended on June 30th. That was about almost $4 billion that has to be refunded. It would override the default refund mechanism in TABOR, and give everybody checks in a flat rate. So again, we probably remember that those Colorado cashback checks that were pretty popular. If Proposition HH passes, every Colorado taxpayer will receive a check of $832 if they're a single filer, double that if you're a dual filer. And that is overriding the default system, which is tied to income tiers, where people who earn more money get a bigger refund check, and people who earn less money get a smaller refund check. Again, if HH fails, that money is going to be refunded through the traditional system. But if it passes for 1 year only, and this is important to highlight, for 1 year only, that money would be refunded. You'll probably get those checks at around April after you file your returns, $832. So there's a nifty chart in this story that kind of talks about, how much people would get. So if you make up to $99,000, your TABOR refund would go up under the flat refund scheme. If you make more than $99,000, your refund would actually go down by as much as about $2,000. It's pretty for joint filers. It's a pretty big hit on that 7% of the population of Colorado taxpayers that earn that. So the majority of folks in Colorado earn up to $99,000. So for the majority of Coloradans, they'd be getting more money. So the big question that I think people want to know, right, and I know that you have to kind of walk through this complicated stuff to get to this crux, is, will Proposition HH save me money? And the way that it interacts with TABOR really complicates that, and it depends on your individual basis. And I can't answer this question and make a blanket statement for everyone. So for instance, if you're a higher earner and your home's worth around the median value, you might not actually, with the reduction in your TABOR refunds over the 10 years of Proposition HH, you might not be, you might come out even, right? But for some folks, you might make a lot more money, and a lot is relative, right? I mean, it could be a couple $100, it could be $1,000. It's hard to parse out. It depends totally on all of these factors. I think this is a really important line in this story. It depends on if you own a home. It depends on how much money you make. It depends on if you own that home, where it is, and then how much it's worth, right? So all of those things, which can differ. Again, my neighbor, to the left and right, are going to have different impacts to this than I will, which is why each Coloradan has to kind of put their information, I think, into this calculator. Is a really good step that you can do to kind of figure it out. Again, this doesn't account though for the truth in taxation provisions, so you kind of have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. Proposition HH lasts for 10 years, and it also lets the legislature at the end of those 10 years renew it without a voter approval. So that's something that you should know. If you sign off on this, you're giving the legislature the ability to continue all the provisions in it beyond the 2032 end date that it would have. So just one final thing before we get into the questions here. I always think we follow the money at the sun. That's kind of one of our big functions. And it's important to know kind of who's spending and to pass this and who's spending against it. Basically, the supporters are Democrats and education groups. A lot of dark money. We don't know who their donors are. That those are political nonprofits that don't have to disclose their donors. And then the other side is really conservative groups. Again, dark money. We've seen almost all of the anti-money come from Advanced Colorado Action, which is a pretty prominent conservative group that funds a lot of conservative initiatives in Colorado. They've donated more than $1 million to it. And then Americans for Prosperity, that's another group that's working on this on the no side. And then in terms of endorsements, the measures opposed by Colorado Municipal League, the Colorado Counties Incorporated, and Special District Association, those are really the big local government groups in the state. And then it's supported by AARP, the Colorado Association of School Boards, professional firefighters, and Colorado Concern, which is a group of business CEOs in the state. So that's kind of the broad overview of the ballot measure. And I think really in order to understand this, you kind of have to go through the bill. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of go through some of the reader questions that we have here. Again, if you have stuff that you want to ask us, feel free to send it over to questions@coloradosun.com or drop it in the chat. And Christina Pritchett, who's helping us out tonight, will send over some of that stuff that we can answer for you. But I think the things that I just want to highlight are, very economic dependent. It's hard to make definitive statements about Proposition HH. Extremely complicated ballot measure, the most complicated that I've covered since I've been covering politics in Colorado. And just a lot of stuff that I think is important for voters to unpack if you want to kind of understand. There's no 30-second easy explanation of it. So I'll just start off with one of the questions that came in about how long does it last. And that, again, we mentioned this at the top, but it's 10 years. The property tax relief plan is in effect for 10 years, at which point the legislature would have to decide whether or not to extend it or not. And depending on who's in charge, I don't have a political crystal ball, but if it's Democrats, I think you can probably expect this to be extended. If it's Republicans, then maybe they tweak it. Obviously, conservative groups are opposed to this. All right, Brian, I'm going to hand you one of your first questions. I'll read it out loud here. This reader is concerned about, how this will affect fire districts, paramedic districts, school districts. Which ones will get backfill, which ones won't. So hoping you can unpack that for the reader.
Yeah. So first of all, excellent overview. Thank you for not making me do that. Yeah, so let's start with school districts, because I think that's really the easiest one to understand, because there's not nearly as many caveats there. So school district, as long as there's TABOR surplus to pay for it, they get all of the money. They get fully reimbursed for any property tax cuts. That's number one. But number two, they actually stand to gain quite a bit from this measure. And that's because there is, over time, potentially going to be even more money created under that TABOR cap through this measure than is needed to backfill the cuts, right? And so in I want to say the second and third years, we're talking about up to like $400 million potentially in additional money that could go to schools under this, as long as the economy keeps growing. And that again, that's in addition to reimbursing any potential like property tax cuts to schools that would have happened under this. So school districts, as long as the economy keeps growing, could do very well in this measure. For local districts, it varies quite a bit, right? And so for your typical kind of city and county governments, and for a lot of other special districts, they would get reimbursed up until your property values in that area rise 20% over 2022 levels, right? So what does that mean? We know property values are going up. If you're going up even 5% a year, and a lot of places are going up much faster than 5% a year, but if it's just 5% a year, I mean, you're going to hit that threshold within the first 4 years, right? Once you hit that level, and some local governments are going to hit that level literally the second that this thing takes effect, the state stops reimbursing them. For your fire districts, ambulances, emergency services, there's kind of another caveat there. Once their property values have grown to that 20% level, the state doesn't pull back all of the reimbursement. It reimburses half of the lost revenue. And so there's yet another complication, because why would we make anything simple? And I honestly don't know how often this will actually come into play. But when Jesse was talking about, that money that's going to be, or that room that's going to be created under the TABOR cap, the money that would have gone back to taxpayers through refunds. So that's the money that's getting used to repay school districts, to give school districts more money, and to repay special districts, right? Local governments and special districts are limited to 20% of whatever that amount is. So let's say there's $100 million in extra room under the TABOR cap. local governments are only getting 20 million of that. It doesn't matter how much property tax revenue they lost, they're only getting 20% of whatever that larger amount is. And initially that is offset a little bit because the legislature is devoting, I think, 200 million general fund dollars to kind of help get this thing started and help local governments with additional assistance to start with. But over time, what we've seen in a lot of the analyses that are out there from legislative staff and so forth is that local governments really don't the money that is getting reimbursed to local governments, it starts dropping off precipitously very fast because of all of these other stipulations. So by like year 3, local governments might be out. I've got a chart somewhere. By year 3, local governments are potentially going to lose $700 million total statewide. And by year 3, they're only projected to get $70 million back from the state. So that's a big gap. I think that it's also quite a bit less than what I think a lot of people think of when they hear that local governments are getting backfilled. And that's part of why you've seen so many local governments come out against this measure, is because they don't feel like it was done transparently. So let me see if there's anything else to kind of address that question. Yeah, so I think that pretty well covers that question.
Yeah, and I think something that's important to remember is that Proposition HH in a way is a gamble on Colorado's economy doing well. There's no guarantee in any given year that the TABOR cap's going to be exceeded. It was designed in a way to prevent it from being exceeded. It was supposed to be a way to limit government growth and spending. So, the TABOR cap's been exceeded in recent years, and that's in part because of economic conditions and the way that inflation works with the TABOR cap. It's been going up faster than the TABOR cap can expand or explain for it or answer for it. And so, there almost certainly will be years where there's not excess over this Prop HH cap, the TABOR cap, and then there's going to be the Prop HH cap. And that's going to potentially mean that there is no backfill for local governments. Schools are first in the backfill mechanism. Second are ambulance districts, fire districts, hospital districts, and then third are counties, library districts, other special districts. And again, they're only getting a portion of the money. So something important to keep in mind here, again, also with the TABOR refund side of things, people, they've been prevalent in recent years, but they're not not an all the time thing. And this maybe gets into the next question that someone was asking. Is Proposition HH, okay, I'm sorry. I've been a full-time Colorado resident taxpayer since 2011. This reader says, how many times has the TABOR cap been exceeded since then to the level where I would have received a meaningful refund check? Well, I don't want to answer the meaningful question, but I can tell you from the perspective of how many times there have been refunds in recent years. Let me just pull this up right here because I don't want to give anyone bad information. But the cap has only been exceeded 6 times since the state's 2005-2006 fiscal year, including in each of the last 3 fiscal years. So, like I mentioned, we're kind of in a unique situation where inflation rose faster than the TABOR cap reflected. So there was that excess in the cap, and nonpartisan legislative and the analysts expect the cap to be exceeded at least in the next 3 years, enough to account for the backfill mechanism in HH and to still give you TABOR refunds. But really, it's anybody's best guess what happens in year 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of this, and unless you really have a crystal ball. I think that's kind of the way we've been explaining it to people, and maybe something to keep in mind for readers too, that's kind of important is, look, there's so many claims about numbers that are being made on both sides of this. Take them with a grain of salt because they're all based on different economic conditions, different mill levy rates, different political assumptions about which counties are going to use that truth in taxation cap. So all of it is someone, inputting certain economic conditions into a calculation and assuming that that's really what's going to happen. As we know, the economy does not work in a linear way, and so all of that stuff is subject to global conflict, the pandemic, things that really quickly will change how much money the state is collecting in tax revenue. All right, Brian, let's go over to the next question that someone had for you along your lines. Um, the, I like this one. What is the true meaning of HH and who really benefits? That one's pretty hard. I'll give that to you.
Thank you so much. Let's see how many people I can get angry at me with this response. I mean, honestly, I think you can take a lot of people at face value when they say that this is about property tax relief. I mean, there's no question that they would not have introduced this. They would not have introduced this if property values weren't going crazy in the state and they weren't hearing from constituents about who are going to be upset when their property tax bills go up. Like, right? So I think when what you hear from the proponents of this is, well, we need property tax relief, and that's why we're doing this. That is absolutely part of the meaning behind this, right? So taking a step back, what happens when you cut property taxes? You cut money to local governments and you cut money to schools. School funding has long been, near and dear to the hearts, particularly of Democrats in the state. And so the legislature and Governor Polis did not want to send out just a blanket tax cut, right? They wanted to send out some property tax relief that also would, not deplete revenue too much for school districts and local governments, right? But the mechanism that they use to pay for that does end up generating quite a bit of money over time. So I'd argue that there's a third reason beyond just protecting local governments from cuts. It's also increasing ultimately funding to schools. That's why they had to go to the ballot. They would not have gone to the ballots just for a tax cut. They went to the ballot because they're trying to get folks to increase that TABOR cap by that 1 percentage point. I mean, that has a chance to be a really meaningful thing for school funding in the state. Some people who support this are very transparent about that, and they say, yes, this is about property tax relief and this is about school funding. Others, they'll kind of end that sentence at property tax relief. And I did a story the other day about how school funding has not necessarily gotten the attention in kind of the public discourse about this that I think it deserves in terms of just how significant it could be over this 10-year period.
Right, and keep in mind the idea that 80% of the TABOR cap increase under Proposition HH goes to schools. And maybe this is kind of a good segue into another reader question, which is, why is HH so confusing? And the answer is because of the backfill mechanism, right? If it weren't for that, you could do just a straight property tax cut, but Democrats were unwilling to kind of leave schools and local districts in the lurch from losing out on the money that they would have gotten had property taxes just gone up organically without any change in it. So when you start to tweak all these different things and you want to make mechanisms and make the budget numbers work, public policy is insanely complicated. And one of the reasons why Colorado is unique is because TABOR requires, voter approval for some of these things. So, Brian went to grad school for public policy and can tell you that most public policy is pretty complicated, but voters oftentimes aren't asked to, approve the sausage being made. But Colorado's unique system under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, requires that voters kind of weigh in on this complicated stuff. So it depends on who you ask, who the winners or losers are. It's really difficult to just make like a blanket statement on that. Again, if you want to make definitive statements about Proposition HH, the three that I feel comfortable with are: it lowers your property tax bill above what it would be if it didn't pass. It increases funding for schools, assuming that the economic conditions are good enough to allow for that. And then three, assuming that the economic conditions are good enough to allow for TABOR refunds, it will make your TABOR refund check smaller. Everything else is kind of dependent on what's happening in the economy in a given time. Let me just look at this. One of the readers wanted to know, is Proposition HH more equitable than how TABOR refunds have traditionally been done? Currently, the Blue Book suggests a very progressive scheme. Higher income people get more refunds. So, I think it depends on who you ask. Again, it's a 1-year change to make the the TABOR refunds flat, the ones that people are going to receive in the 2024 for the 2022-23 fiscal year. You know, Democrats argue that's a way more equitable way to do things in terms of a progressive tax scheme, right? The 6-tier refund mechanism tied to income levels is more, you know, the people who are presumably paying more in taxes are getting more back in refunds. But again, like everything, you know, tax rates and tax bills depend on so many different things in terms of personal circumstance and what exemptions you claim, et cetera. So hard to say, you know, it's kind of the eyes in the beholder. I encourage people to use some of those calculators to kind of look at, you know, how Proposition HH would affect your refunds. One of the things that Brian and I were talking about that's kind of interesting is that under the flat rate refund change in Proposition HH, people who make $99,000 up to $99,000 would get more in that first year, but that benefit gets erased in the second year by the way that the TABOR cap gets reduced. So keep that in mind. There's kind of asterisks and everything in this ballot measure. A couple readers, Brian, wanted to know about how Proposition HH affects the homestead tax exemption for seniors. We go into that in the explainer, but can you kind of briefly talk about, you know, what that impact is?
Yeah, so right now, if you're a senior, the way you get this tax break is by staying in the same home for 10 plus years, right? So that's created this pretty stupid situation where seniors like can't move, otherwise they will they'll lose that tax break, right? And so one of the things that this measure does is it would make that homestead exemption portable. So you don't have to be, if you move, you don't have to stay in the next home another 10 years to still get that exemption. And I don't think it kicks in right away. It might be 25 or 26. But my understanding was if you moved in like 2024, right? Like if you've already moved, once it kicks in 2026, like you could go back and get it, right? So it's not like you can't move until 2026. It's the way I've understood it. But yeah, that's one of those things that has long been kind of pointed to by policymakers as being kind of a drag on our housing market, right? Because if you can't move, if you're a senior and you want to downsize, then what are you going to do? You're going to stay in your house, and no one else can move into that house. Yeah, so like our tax policies, the way they're currently written, are basically encouraging people to stay put when it might be more advantageous for them to move.
Yeah, and the governor has kind of talked about this as an issue, as you mentioned, in the broader housing conversation. You know, Colorado, one of the reasons why prices are so high in Colorado is because there's a lack or dearth of housing. And so, you know, if you start to move people out of those single family homes, seniors who maybe want to downsize, incentivize them to keep that homestead property tax exemption, which is $100,000 exemption on value taxation, up to $100,000, and that's in addition to the $40,000 or $50,000 that they would get under Proposition HH. So that's a pretty big chunk of their home that they don't pay taxes on, and it's the exemption would be transferable starting in the 2025 tax year. And it would be, I believe, retroactive. And with some of this stuff, right, like Brian and I have worked really hard to understand this, but for specific examples, I always encourage people to call their county assessor or their CPA or whatever, people who can maybe look at their specific situation and answer questions. So, you know, just always keep that in mind. Brian, and again, I'll just remind folks, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or send them over to questions@coloradosun.com. One of the questions that we got in during the event, Brian, that I think, you know, you kind of looked at this before in terms of school funding and previous Colorado reporting, but someone says, I've seen a lot of arguments on the internet saying there's no accountability for the general fund money to go back to schools. How does this proposition ensure schools are guaranteed this reimbursement?
Well, I would say it's like every other school funding measure that's been approved by voters, right? it's something the legislature could change, right? It does direct them to take the Tabor cap money, put it back into schools, right? It does say, hey, this isn't supposed to displace existing general fund money that's going to, like, it's written in a way that says you're not supposed to reduce other state aid at the same time that you're getting this new money in, right? But you talk to school finance advocates across the state, and there is some concern there, right? Like there's always the chance, like, what if we have a massive recession in a few years? Folks that were following kind of the school funding debates, like coming out of the Great Recession, remember what happened then was that lawmakers broke promises to schools. They increased what's now known as the budget stabilization factor. They did not increase school funding the way that they're required to under the law, under the state constitution. So I think it's certainly possible that lawmakers would later decide to kind of go against the will of voters on this and not send as much to schools. But I think that's a chance with anything. I think to the extent that you can have assurances, like this provides some assurances, right? You can't really predict what's going to happen politically, because at the end of the day, you can't prevent future legislatures from changing their minds. But when voters approve something like this, I think it's politically very difficult, especially when you're Democrats in the majority and you rely a lot on the support of teachers and so forth. It would be very difficult for them to kind of go back on this promise, I would say. There would be political repercussions for them.
Right, and I think sometimes people don't always understand that there are two kinds of ballot measures in Colorado. There's statutory changes, and then there are constitutional changes. This is a statutory change. The one thing that the legislature can't touch, it can't raise the Tabor cap on its own, right? That's why this is going to voters, and everything else in the bill can be changed just by a simple majority vote in the legislature. So that's something important to keep in mind. And I guess along those lines, a reader had a really interesting question that I think is probably ripe for us to write about, actually. This person wants to know, how does Proposition HH affect any of the funding approved by voters in 2022 for housing through Proposition 123? And so for folks who maybe remember that, it's a $290 million use of Tabor surplus to pay for housing projects in Colorado. It's actually a pretty good point, because Proposition HH is kind of using that money now, using that a lot of Tabor surplus for a different purpose. So again, this increases the longer that Proposition HH is in effect. But like, I do see a potential scenario where the funding requirements of Proposition 123 collide with the Proposition HH requirements, and maybe there's not enough money for Proposition 123. Again, Proposition 123, we're talking about kind of statutory changes, is always envisioned as something that the legislature could play with if it needed to, if it got into a situation where there wasn't enough Tabor surplus. But it's a really good question, and it's part of this kind of unique tapestry that Proposition HH sets up in terms of the state budget, Tabor, and kind of the broader fiscal picture of the state. Brian. Oh, this is an easy one for you. Are non-property owners allowed to vote on property tax issues?
Yes, they are.
Well, and the answer is easy, but I think the question, right, like, is important, because there's a lot of renters who are kind of wondering, what does Proposition HH do for me? And I think, it depends on whether or not you believe what the proponents of this say, which is that, their hope is that property owners, if their property taxes aren't going up as much, that it's money that wouldn't be passed along to the renters. There is a $20 million set aside in this bill in further years for people to help them, prevent them from being evicted if property taxes rise and that causes their rent to go up. It's supposed to be a way to assist them in those situations. Again, $20 million split among 30% of the state or so are renters. You can see how that goes probably pretty quickly. But yeah, I mean, this is something that all Coloradans are going to decide on, whether or not they're homeowners or not, or where they live, depending on how they benefit. Um, One thing I think is important for renters to keep in mind is that, maybe they're in that less than $99,000 range, so they're going to get a bigger TABOR refund in the first year. But then, they start to the subsidies to pay for the property tax relief in future years are going to eat into their TABOR refund check. So that's an argument that the opponents make, which is an accurate one. Again, that's counteracted by what the proponents say in terms of, you're not going to have to hopefully pay as much, because the property owners are not going to pass along their property tax increase. We only have a couple more questions here, so I'll go through these. Again, if anyone has last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or send them to questions@coloradosun.com. One of the readers wanted to know, there was a conservative lawsuit that sued to invalidate Proposition HH for a whole bunch of reasons, including a violation of what's known as the state's single subject rule, which says that ballot measures can only deal with like a single subject. They can't, say, we're going to raise the TABOR cap and we're going to relocate the Broncos to Pueblo, right? Like, it has to only deal with one thing at a time. The judge in the case reviewed Proposition HH and made a ruling that, courts, the judicial branch and the legislative branch are separate. And so it wasn't, he didn't have standing to question it. But he also said, look, if I was going to rule on this, I don't think that this violates a single subject rule anyways. So it was a standing issue, but also rejected the arguments of the conservative groups that it violated the single subject rule in the Constitution. This is an interesting question that Brian and I are kind of exploring. What happens if HH and Initiative 50, which is on the ballot now in 2024, both pass? So for those to keep in mind, again, there's so much economic dependency on HH, on how it affects individual taxpayers, but then there's also Initiative 50, which is on the 24 ballot, which would cap the statewide increase in property taxes each year to 4%, unless there's a vote of the people to override that cap. So that would be a constitutional change that would act on top of Proposition HH. So all the Proposition HH property tax limiting provisions and the backfill mechanisms would remain, and then you'd have this 4% cap on top of that. It's a little hard to think about that right now, since we don't know if HH passes or not, but it is something to kind of keep in mind. I don't know, Brian, do you have anything else to add on that in terms of the long-term effects and the trajectory of the two kind of colliding?
Honestly, I have not taken the time to kind of think about the ways those two would interact, but they would certainly have some kind of some interesting they would have some interesting overlaps. Let me put it that way, because some of the things that the legislature is trying to do in this one, maybe you don't need to do if you have this other one that's also taking effect. Yeah, no, that is a headache for another day, I think.
Yeah, it took me a few weeks just to kind of go through Proposition HH, but I think you're raising some interesting questions about like how the backfill mechanism would work if the state could be on the hook for a lot of money in that case. Well, I think that's all of the questions we have in here. Brian, is there anything that I've kind of left out that you want to address for folks?
I did have just a thought on the single subject thing. I was recalling when I worked for the Denver Post about 5-6 years ago, there was a bill that was also challenged on single subject grounds, and it did a lot of things. It dealt with the hospital provider fee and transportation funding and like all kinds of different stuff. It probably did some stuff with TABOR. And the way they survived single subject in that case was calling it concerning the sustainability of rural Colorado. So courts in the past have allowed a lot of very generic things to kind of tie together things that you might not normally think of as being a single subject.
Yeah, I think the courts are unwilling to take that on. Awesome. Well, I think that's kind of all the questions that we have here for tonight. There was one that came in over YouTube, but I think we answered it in terms of accountability for general fund money going back to schools. Brian kind of addressed that. But as always, if you have questions from about Proposition HH or Proposition II or other ballot measures, feel free to send them over to us at the Colorado Sun Politics team. Questions at coloradosun.com. We're always happy to kind of dig into this stuff. But I think more than any other ballot measure, maybe in recent years in Colorado, it's important for Colorado voters to kind of dig through the details of this if they want to understand it. The ballot measure language doesn't really give you paint a picture of all the different things that get affected by Proposition HH. So if you want to truly understand it, I encourage you to kind of check out our story at coloradosun.com. Hopefully there's a link to that in the chat. You can find it. It's right on our homepage. But again, you can always reach us to questions at coloradosun.com. We're always happy to answer any of your prompts on anything policy related. Thank you guys again so much for listening in tonight. Thank you for being a Colorado Sun member to support us and making this work possible. Again, it's super easy to join. coloradosun.com/join. This kind of work is so important to help folks understand what's on their ballot and hopefully give them the information they need to cast, make their decisions at the ballot box. And yeah, happy voting. Don't mail your ballot back in after Monday. You got to drop it off at a ballot box. And look forward to election day. We'll see how things